So if you're not familiar with the Dark Souls series, basically it was a really good RPG hack and slash type game. And, if you have interest in that, I highly recommend it if you've never played it. But if you are familiar with it, then of course you're aware of how the armor and weapons all had weight to them. And the more weight that you had, basically it decreased your movement. So if you were really, really heavy, you could not roll very fast. You couldn't dodge very fast. And it basically hampered your ability because obviously you were designed to be tanky, so you couldn't really avoid many hits. Now this kind of feature isn't really unknown to FPS games. One of my favorites actually was Brink. This was basically Bethesda's attempt to recreate the Team Fortress formula. And I'm not going to lie, I really enjoyed the game when I played it. I played it for a few months actually. But the concept in this one was that you had three character types. So you had your light, your medium, and your heavy character. And of course, the light character was more of a scout, and you could basically jump a little bit further, climb higher, and basically explore areas that most characters couldn't get to or would take, a lot longer pathway to actually get there. And of course, the heavy was, a rather slow character, but he could carry, like the miniguns and the rocket launcher, that kind of, the big weapons, to do, a lot of the damage. And although this concept isn't really seen in that many FPS games, it does exist, and I think it's actually rather enjoyable to see it. But that brings me into the topic of this video. Yesterday I ended up, searching through Twitter and saw that Frederick had made another post that I really just, I love these posts. I mean, they just tell you so much information, and it does, kind of get to me a little bit. It's like, oh man, so many cool ideas that they were thinking about, could have had, and potentially made this game a lot more interesting in the build depth perspective, right? I mean, some people may not, see it as good. Some people may really think it's cool. I choose to think that it could have been cool. But basically, Rider.coms was just kind of making a comment about movement speed being affected by your armor value. So, if you had a high armor, you could have, a very slow speed or something like that. Well, Frederick replied that, very interesting for you to say that. It was one of the first things that we did for Division 2. Make light, medium, and heavy armor types that affected movement. Heavy even made you unable to roll. The idea was tested and scrapped though. One small part reason being keeping up in co-op. Now I find that really interesting. I mean, obviously they tested some things in their game. And, just the thought of this being in the game, really interests me. And to be honest, this was something that I was talking about on the Division forums maybe 2 years ago or so. I mean, I talked about this kind of thing in the game. And of course, I think I went into, how if you had like a really heavy weapon like an LMG, that maybe it should have different bonuses. Obviously, if you have an LMG or if you have, like two large weapons, so like a sniper rifle and an LMG, maybe you should move a little bit slower or jump over things a little bit slower. Whereas if you're just equipped with, like a two SMGs and a pistol, then maybe you should be able to move a little bit faster. Just kind of playing into that role of the weapon type, giving it a little bit more diversity and more purpose. So you could increase the damage that LMGs and snipers do, while basically giving them a different drawback. And you could have the benefit of SMGs being that you're moving faster because you have a shorter range on them. So I mean, with the RPG balance and just kind of trying to incorporate some real world mechanics or trade-offs in the game, you do need to have these kind of things. You can't, if you just go based completely on stats, like, okay, so I'm just going to add weapon damage or I'm going to add armor. It does create a balance in a sense. But as you can see now, when you just have very basic, balancing, it doesn't work as well as you'd probably hope. You need different modifiers to different stats that actually improve the character or change the character's, basic function. Just like how they tried to do with the mod slots for weapons. Like you can kind of see in the plus 20 round AR magazine now, where you lose a little bit of reload speed. Obviously, when the game launched, they had a lot more negatives to that, but everyone complained because they didn't understand. And of course, guess what? Now we're going into it, and these problems just keep compounding on themselves because there is no balance, and anytime they try to make balance, players hate it. But when you actually make a balanced system that has different benefits to it that actually outline the negatives clearly, I think that has a much more broad appeal to it than just saying, okay, well, you can get 20 rounds, but we're going to, remove 50% of your reload speed. I mean, when you go to dramatic extremes just to emphasize a point, yeah, it doesn't feel good. But when you actually incorporate that into the build properly, it can feel fun. And this is part of the reason why I'm so opposed to having such a very simple stat system. In an RPG game, you can't get away with very simple stats. And that's the problem that we see now. With these very specific talents, you see a lot of OP builds or you see a lot of unfair gameplay. And that's because the system is just too simple to actually support itself. When you just cut away all of the depth to it, it doesn't feel good. There is no way to build around these things. There's no real, counter to this stuff. And that's where people start having these problems. Now, I get it. Some people don't want to think about the depth of the game. Some people don't want to actually understand what these things mean. They just want what they want, and that's it. But unfortunately, this is the actual problem with the game. People don't like these limits that they put on the game, even if these limits are for the betterment of the game itself. So while some of you may hate a very detailed RPG system, it is much better for balance, it is much better for PvP, it is much better for build diversity to actually have a lot of these stats that benefit each other, that have negatives towards other stats, because that creates a balanced system with trade-off. Okay, give and take is basically the name of the game in this type of situation. If you don't have the give and take, then basically you're stuck with people using, okay, well, this is the only thing I'm going to use because it's the only thing that works, and that's boring. That's why we have these problems. I mean, I can't push that issue enough. We have these problems because it is too simple. You cannot have a very detailed type RPG game where you want to crowd in all these different mechanics and then not add choices for the player to actually choose from. You can't get away with that because it doesn't work. We see it's not working. So if you doubt me, well, then show me in the Division where it's working. Show me how great the Division is because, they made it simple. It's not. It doesn't work that way. Okay? So the more players keep trying to say, oh, this should be easier, this should be more simple, this should be more basic, blah, 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 then you start complaining about, oh, it doesn't work, this is broken. Guess what? That's why it's broken. Because no one is actually paying attention to why it's not working. You keep trying to take away stuff. Oh, skills are too overpowered. We need to nerf skills. It's not the skills' fault that there's no mechanic to stop them. Okay? Besides EMP. But once you're already affected by a status effect, guess what? That's because there's no real good counter to it because the game is too simple. Okay? There's no real good counter to being one-shot because the game is too simple. They have to nerf things and nerf things and nerf things, and then people get upset. I don't understand why people do not understand this aspect of the game. If you want to play just a simple, basic shooter, then move to something like Call of Duty. But if that doesn't interest you and you actually like building, you actually like playing this game, then you need to accept that these stats, this depth of gameplay, is what makes the game balanced. When you start nitpicking and taking away the things that you don't like, that's when you start unraveling the whole ball of yarn and the game just doesn't work anymore. That's what we see with Division 2. It was made to be a completely different game, and they just keep narrowing the field of vision and basically just removing a lot of the stuff that actually balanced itself. Alright, so that's the end of that rant. But I do think it's actually worth looking into, this type of mechanic. I mean, they looked at it as a possible solution, and I'm assuming it was probably a solution more towards the whole chicken dancing thing from Division 1. Just kind of, adding a little bit more layers to it. And, they ultimately decided that it didn't work or wasn't right for the game. But you see a lot of these issues that they, tested things out on, and some of these ideas are actually really cool. I think that if they actually dived a little bit deeper in some of this stuff, and they actually experimented more, pushed the boundaries of what they wanted from this RPG, MMO, looter, shooter, whatever you want to call it game, I think that we could actually have a much better game itself. I mean, part of the problem that the Division had was it was designed to be a much more detailed RPG type game. And of course, when you start cutting back the RPG and you leave that whole system expecting it to be an RPG, that's when you have a lot of these problems. And like I said, that's what we saw in Division 1, where things just didn't feel right, like Threat. Threat didn't feel right. Scavenging with, finding items didn't work because obviously they cut back on a lot of these things just to make it fit the mold of the third-person shooter that they were trying to, I guess, present to the players, right? It seemed like they were almost trying to walk back from the RPG aspect and just make it a very simple game. which is a shame because I think that's the biggest part that actually interested players. Making your own builds, playing a different play style, playing a unique way to you, actually going into combat with players or with AI and, testing out your build fully. I think that interested a lot of players. And I think it's a shame that they kind of backed away from it for whatever reason. And I wish that they would actually go back, and I hope that if Division 3, materializes sometime in the future, or if they're currently working on it now, I really do hope that they reevaluate some of these decisions that they've made. I hope that they really go back into this stuff and put the RPG back into the game like it deserves to be. Because if they don't, the only option that they have is to make it a very simple shooter, to basically just cut away as much of the RPG as possible, and then what's the point of playing it? I mean, it's not really that great of a shooter without the RPG, without the actual building aspect, without the uniqueness of it. It's not that great of a game. But I do understand people's worries like, well, I don't want to play World of Warcraft. Look, I get it. You don't want to play World of Warcraft. You probably never did play World of Warcraft if you're saying that. I'm not talking about tab targeting like I mentioned in that one tweet. That's not something that interests me. Obviously, I play this game because I want the shooter feel in the RPG world. Now, that is something that I think a lot of players want. Obviously, if you are playing this game, and if you like building, and if you like these stats, and you like finding your gear, you know what, then unfortunately, what you are really saying is that you actually like the RPG. You're just basically opposed to the RPG title for whatever reason, because you're obsessed with it being a free-to-play mobile game. That's fine. But if you want this game to actually be good, and you want this game to actually improve what makes it unique and fun, then you need to start embracing that this game was built to be an RPG and have these bespoke RPG mechanics. But that's all I wanted to say in this video, guys. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.